Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Monday, May the 2nd, 2022. I'm going to start off today, this week, by talking about the city where I live, Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. And if you have heard me speak about Victoria in the past, you will have heard me express my anger and disgust about what has happened to my city. Here's a story by Catherine Lake Burrs in the Toronto Star yesterday. And let's see, Burrs is described as a management consultant and writer on Vancouver Island and Toronto. I think it would be fair to describe this woman as a homeless advocate. And it is my firm belief that homeless advocates are largely responsible for the horror into which Victoria is falling. She begins, her day has just begun, but by the time she walks a single block from where she stows her bicycle to the grim Victoria sidewalk that is home for the people she helps, Millie Modeste has already comforted three homeless and addicted souls. Lily weeps as Modeste assures her that bylaw officers will let her stay in her tent while she grieves her husband's overdose death. Alan smiles when Modeste tells him she's negotiating with a landlord on his behalf, and Ali gives her a hug for arranging a medical appointment to assess her scoliosis. Don't worry, Modeste tells her. We will get you all fixed up. Under blankets and umbrellas, some 40 people huddle on the north side of Pandora Street, just west of Quadra. I should note that is about a 5-minute walk from where I'm sitting today. Gloria smokes crack in full view, and two men ask Bill for a 20 piece, about zero point 0.2 grams of crack, as Modeste sits down with them. Nearly 70 others cluster in bunches on the south side of Pandora. The largest group are heroin addicts, Modeste says. The others mostly use meth or speed. Modeste, a 53-year-old Inuit volunteer, once homeless and an addict herself, has devoted the last 12 months to helping unhoused crack cocaine users almost daily on Pandora's north side. The one-woman rescue crew is on a crusade to keep Victoria's homeless people alive as deaths from toxic drugs take more lives in British Columbia than all other unnatural causes combined, and many more deaths than the coronavirus. I'm one of the lucky ones. I was able to channel my skills in addiction, Modeste says, and this is what I am meant to do. Bill, who looks about Modeste's age, shivers in a t-shirt as she assures him that bylaw officers who confiscate belongings between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. to uphold the city's new no camping rules will return his clothes and sleeping bag. Bill spent 2 days in hospital this week, recovering from third-degree burns suffered when someone set his tent on fire. An electrician before becoming an addict, Bill says he trusts Modeste in a way. He can't trust officials or agency workers. It's really dark in the city now, he says, describing a sense of doom that envelops the community. But Millie understands us. Well, yes, it is really dark in the city now, and there is a sense of doom that enables the community. It is brought on by these people and their enablers. They're drug users, and they are driven mad by drugs, or they were already mad, and use drugs as some kind of self-medication. But you notice that there doesn't seem to be any kind of interest in getting these people off drugs. And it is true enough because I have met and spoken to a number of such people. They do not trust the government or anyone who works for the government. I've spoken to many people in Victoria, homeless by choice, who have let me know that despite the fact that the government could get them a place to stay, they are not interested. They do not want to be under the heel of social workers as they see it. Back to the Star story. Armed with clothes, foods, and tents donated by her personal network, Modeste offers counseling to unhoused addicts. She helps people find housing and healthcare. She organizes art products to combat depression and anxiety. She carries a Naxalone kit containing an antidote to reverse the effects of opioid overdose and uses it often. I just got my 21st life, Modeste said. That is 21 kids that would not be alive. I got them breathing. Modeste is lucky to be alive too. Her mother, Bella, survived 9 years of residential school in Aklavik, Northwest Territories, and returned in 1959 at age 15 to a plague of alcoholism and domestic abuse in her Inuvik home. Bella was beaten so severely when she was pregnant that Modeste was born prematurely, weighing just over 2 pounds. Yes, and it's the residential schools that are the torture, not the households in which these Native people grew up. As a young woman, Modeste struggled with alcoholism, but she can count on one hand her drinks in the past 10 years. She says she uses crack in moderation now. She says, I am a functioning addict. Her husband, Jim Williams, a 60s scoop survivor, was addicted to crystal meth when she met him more than 25 years ago, he says, and still struggles from time to time. You may be asking yourself, what is the 60s scoop? Well, it is a manufactured horror in my country. You just heard this woman describe the horrible household conditions that she grew up in. And as a result of this, particularly in the 1960s, hence the 60s scoop, a fair number of Native Indians in Canada ended up with nice white people who gave them homes where they weren't going to be neglected, beaten, or killed. And apparently this is a great crime. I'm reading from Wikipedia. On the 14th of February 2017, Ontario Superior Court Justice Edward Bello-Baba ruled that the government was liable for the harm caused by the 60s scoop. And on October 6, 2017, an $800 million settlement was announced for the Martel case. And I believe the Human Rights Commission, Canadian Human Rights Commission, I could be getting this wrong, announced that every so-called survivor of the 60s scoop was to get a payoff. I believe it was $25,000. I knew several prominent people in Canada who adopted Indian children, but apparently this is just terrible, 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 because these people should be left, in the households that place their lives in danger. But of course, the fact that household conditions in so many Aboriginal families in Canada are horrific is, of course, entirely the fault of white people, because Indians, it seems, have no agency. But back to the story. And there are a fair number of Indians that I see on the street. I wouldn't say it's overwhelming. In May 2020, when Modeste and Williams packed their possessions and started the drive from their longtime home in Kamloops, BC, toward Victoria, they had no idea that they would join Canada's rising tide of homelessness and addiction. They also had no idea that they would become part of trying to hold back that tide. I'm not so sure that's true. Again, people have told me, I have met homeless people from all over Canada, and years ago, the word went out, come to Victoria. Victoria is the warmest city, certainly in winter, in Canada, and the number of government supports for homeless people is very, very high indeed. As you know, there is a homeless shelter directly across the street from me, and another one half a block down the road, and another one like 3 blocks. The city of Victoria does not like to talk about where these structures are, because the area around these homeless shelters is becoming a ghost town. No business wants to be near them for obvious reasons. Modeste and Williams were not alone in deciding to make Victoria their new home when they were evicted in the spring of 2020. The BC capital saw its homeless population grow to twice the homeless population per capita of Toronto and 5 times that of Vancouver in the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. 5 times worse than Vancouver. Given that Vancouver has gone similarly crazy in misplaced sympathy for these people, that is rather shocking. Unable to find affordable housing, Modeste and Williams settled into the city's beloved Beacon Hill Park near the town center with hundreds of others. Beacon Hill Park is like Victoria's version of Stanley Park. It is right on the ocean, and of course, Beacon Hill Park, one of the great amenities of the city of Victoria, has become a hellhole. They were lucky to have a van to live in and not just a tent, Modeste says. At night, I heard women just bawling their eyes out, just wailing. Tanya and her partner, Bridget, knew Modeste from their days living in the park. They say Modeste saw that food and garbage pickups were needed in the park and began to advocate for the community. She worked with the Red Cedar Cafe to provide hot breakfasts and dinners to the campers, together with Rose Henry, an advocate for the homeless known as Grandma Losa. Modeste and Williams held weekly meetings with park residents. By the fall of 2020, they had become known as the Mom and Pop of Beacon Hill. 56-year-old Tanya looks like she would have been more at home in a country club than on a dirty sidewalk. But Tanya overdosed just hours ago and was rescued by paramedics. She's been homeless on and off for 15 years. Someone who's been homeless on and off for 15 years does not look as if she would be more at home in a country club than a dirty sidewalk. She accepts a sandwich from Modeste's bag. Millie goes the extra mile. She doesn't judge, and she always has a smile. Tanya says she is terrified by the overdose deaths that surround them on Pandora Street. As Victoria's homeless population rose to record numbers, BC's drug supply also became more deadly. The powerful opioid fentanyl, the leading cause of overdose death, now appears laced into more than 80% of street drugs, and benzodiazepines, tranquilizers that can cause unconsciousness, in more than half, 3 times the rate of a year ago. Tanya and Bridget deal small quantities of crack and heroin to support their survival and try to take care that their products don't hurt the community they love. They are mourning the death of their close friend, Sarah, who was found dead in her apartment after an overdose. The benzos are putting people to sleep. Maybe that's what happened to Sarah, Tanya says. But then she was also sick. She had a bad abscess and she'd been sick for days. Deaths from toxic overdoses, homicides, and fires skyrocketed in Victoria's homeless communities in early 2021, inspiring a radical approach by the BC government to house the campers. Everyone knew something had to be done, BC Attorney General David Eby said in an interview. He committed to find homes for all unhoused people in Canada, but the city's vacancy rate, which at 1% was the lowest in Canada, required an innovative gamble. The provincial government has since bought 3 hotels to shelter more than 300 people and developed 430 additional shelter spaces for people with complex needs, spending almost $130 million a year. Together with the City of Victoria, it has also invested in affordable housing. Everyone pulled together to make it happen, Eby said, noting that Victoria City councillors, police, and residents have a culture of understanding and supporting vulnerable people. Victoria is a unique city that way. He says it wasn't the approach of other cities. And let's look at the results, shall we? Before we start patting ourselves on the back. Even so, says Modeste, who was lucky to get a space in a subsidized apartment, many of Victoria's unhoused are still suffering. More than 80% are described by the province as long-term homeless, which means they've been unhoused for more than 6 months. Some are second and third generation homeless, Modeste says. Many of the people still homeless need more skilled addictions and mental health care than current services offer, advocates say. Gloria, a rape survivor, says she uses crack to treat her depression. It's an adrenal tonic, she says, that helps with severe stress trauma over long periods of time. Well, it's nice to know they picked up the jargon. Victoria Mayor Lisa Helps told The Star that about 80 people with complex addiction and mental health needs are still living on the streets, and about 80 have shelter but spend most of their times outdoors. The progressive mayor's mission is to get functional zero homelessness by 2024. She hopes that Victoria can create enough supports and services that when someone becomes homeless, escaping domestic violence, for example, they would not be homeless for long. It's going to be a real push. Help says. And one wonders whether any tourists will want to come to Victoria at that time, or whether anyone will ever want to go downtown by that time. And I will point out that this is not restricted to downtown. Of course, Beacon Hill Park is a long way from downtown. And the scourge of homeless people, drug addicted homeless people, and otherwise wandering the streets, screaming obscenities, pissing on the streets, throwing their needles everywhere, just getting into ferocious arguments, the police being called, the constant wail of police cars and ambulances. This is the future that the leaders of Victoria and the provincial government have chosen. Again, homelessness and drug addiction have been incentivized in Victoria. And it's an industry. Drug addiction treatment is an industry, and it's an industry that pays well. The idea, despair breeds addiction. Well, as it turns out, as we learned from Theodore Dalrymple, that most drug addicts were criminals before they became addicted. But no, we can't try to find a way to get these people off drugs. They'll just keep overdosing and overdosing and overdosing until they finally die one way or another. It seems a kind of culling, as far as I can see, of a group of people which is highly objectionable. And I'll have more to say about this a little later. One final thing from the story. Now that it is evening, Tanya frets about Bridget, who says she has overdosed 5 nights this week. She needs help, Tanya says, but Modesta laments that the wait is up to 6 months to get into a detox program and even longer for an inpatient treatment program. Bridget spent 12 months in jail for selling $20 worth of drugs to an undercover police officer in 2020. She is terrified to go back there. Well, there's a link to this story from Victoria News. Homeless woman sentenced to 18 months of jail for selling drugs to Victoria police officer. And this woman has a long criminal history. Her name is actually Janine Frances Keelt, described as struggling with a heroin addiction. A pre-sentence report states that the 53-year-old moved to Victoria from Ontario in 1992. She currently lives in a tent with her partner of 14 years. And while she is not employed, she has held jobs in Victoria. Keelt was raised by her grandmother as her mother struggled with addiction and her father was not in the picture. She expressed feeling anxiety and stress about being homeless, describing it as hell, but has not engaged in counseling since 2002. Her criminal record consists of 2 dated offenses for drug trafficking, which the judge did not treat as an aggravating factor, along with 6 convictions for theft under $5,000, spanning the years of 2009 to 2016, although she has not served any jail time during that period. Well, Theodore Dalrymple points out in his book, Understanding Opiates, that in Asia, they do things a little differently. They put people in cells and wait until they are detoxed. And it doesn't take all that long. We have built up this myth about opiates that it is almost impossible for people to quit them. And so what we should do, apparently, as these people wreck our cities, is to accommodate them as much as possible. And let's go to the chat. Hello to Don Willis and Ann Run, Dan Allison and Dan. Jokin 666. Dan Allison says, I used to do homeless ministry downtown with my church. Turned out they had homes, paid rent with their disability check, blew the rest on booze or porn, then sat in the park bumming money rest of the month. Hello to Hypocrite at the Gate. I love KMG Monday, says Don Willis. Yo Mama, hello, says Kevin, would you do Industrial Society and its Consequences for the book club? I'll have to remember that. Don't be setting my tent on fire, damn it, says Hypocrite at the gate. Well, these tent cities, and they're not supposed to be on the streets. They are on the street. They are a block away from here. Right now, as I speak, there is a tent with the usual pile of detritus all around it. It's just everywhere. The other thing I didn't mention is so many of these homeless people have dogs, which is strange because typically people who are destitute cannot afford to have pets, and they drag around their dogs, many of which are large and menacing. And now we have a plague of dog excrement on our streets. Hello to Gamion. Industrial society and its future. Okay. Yo Mama says, I happen to know for a fact that I live on ceded land. Kevin, what are your general thoughts on Louis Riel? Says Enron. He was a madman who thought that he was going to be the Pope of North America. Seriously, he did. He was deranged. He was also a murderer. That's why he was executed. Apparently, that's, Quebec doesn't like us because we executed Louis Riel. Don from Beyond says, I was watching the Salty Cracker on BitChute and didn't realize it was past 7 o'clock. Very happy, Kevin, broadcasting in money. Well, thank you. Hello to Tom Anderson. Are the elites intentionally overlooking the fentanyl crisis as a way of indirectly taking care of the homeless problem? One suspects. One suspects. Hello to T, who says hi from Ireland. And hello to Brian Frakes. Bring back the stocks, says Yo Mama. 2 weeks in a row, observes Oscar Toe. And okay, who else do we have here? Visionary Companion, hello to you. Many on the street refuse to conform. Well, yes, they do. Oscar Toe reminds us that Ken Russell's Mauler is on YouTube in full. Stephen Casanza says the U District in Seattle has a homeless camp now set up by the city, Little Houses. I've spent some time in the U District in Seattle, and I thought it was a great neighborhood to be in. But Seattle is becoming hellish. Hello to Martin Matushak. Have you watched Mahler? Asked Oscar Toe. No, I have not. For the reason that there's Listomania and his feature films about composers seem to me deranged. Perhaps Mahler is. Well, I've seen descriptions and I've seen pictures. They're pretty high concept. Don Willis says St. Petersburg has a great Little Houses program. Pretty cool. That's the plan. We're all going to be living in tiny houses. And the dog is like, I could be doing this on my own. Old Norm Macdonald joke, says Anne Run. Yeah, that's a good joke. Visionary Companion says, hello, I could tell you some stories about Teen Feed and homeless outreach scam in Seattle. Teens, huh? Peculiar interest in teens, do they? Okay. So now I'm going to be talking. Oh, yeah. You may have heard me read from stories which have been curated by Kane from Citizen Free Press. And there's a story about this fellow on thewriting.com. Say hello to Kane, the secretive maestro behind Citizen Free Press, one of conservative media's most popular websites. Sorry about that. There's no mystery behind the success of the enigmatic Citizen Free Press conservative website. All it took was one obsessed news junkie tolling almost every waking hour for the post 1,825 straight days, curating right-wing content specifically tailored to capture the MAGA zeitgeist. Today, after the site's May 1st, 5th anniversary, it's clear that Citizen Free Press has quietly emerged as a growing force in conservative media. Outside of the much-visited digital arm of Fox News, CFP generates more page views than any other conservative website as measured by SimilarWeb. A link from Citizen Free Press, highly coveted in the right-wing world, can unleash a river of traffic. When CFP linked to the writing on April 25th, it drove more than 20,000 viewers to my site. Another link last October resulted in my most trafficked day in 2021. CFP defies early descriptions. It's not incorrect to call it an aggregation site for right-wing viewpoints, but that ignores the snippets of original content that are sprinkled into the majority of the stories. Each day, about 100 headlines are posted on CFP's austere homepage in a simple linear design, giving the site a heavy 1999 AOL vibe. It looks like a seventh grader built it, confesses the site's somewhat mysterious founder, who has a fondness for staying off stage in the shadows, preferring the glow of his never-off computer monitor to the spotlight of media attention. Steve Bannon has described CFP as the stack, and for once Bannon and I agree on something. Headlines feature a simple sentence like AOC goes full stupid or the Donald in top form. About a quarter of the headlines follow the classic aggregation format and take visitors to external sources, usually somewhere in the conservative media ecosystem, but most lead farther into the site where the story is fleshed out with Twitter videos, short commentary, and images, all provided by the curator. It's not close to what is traditionally considered narrative nonfiction or mainstream journalism. However, scan enough CFP headlines and the news of the day shifts into focus, even if it's a mile wide and an inch deep. And of course, it's all filtered through CFP's right-tilting lens, which is clearly not the preferred perspective of about half the country. The maestro behind this growing micromedia empire is a 50-ish news junkie who goes by the one-word name Kane, an obvious Citizen Kane reference, the film about the notorious press baron William Randolph Hearst. He acknowledges that Kane is not his real name. He has lived in Bloomington, Indiana for more than 20 years with his partner Liz. He lifts weight, rides his bike, and like golfing before CFP claimed all his free time. Kane says he's been toiling away on his site every day without a single day off since he launched it with little fanfare in 2017. He was posted at the perfect time for the downfall of Drudge and Drudge turning on Trump, says former Drudge editor Joseph Curl, who launched his own conservative aggregator, Off the Press, last October. Plus, Kane's sensibilities are so good. To generate the huge volume of headlines he provides, Kane uses 3 browsers simultaneously with more than 75 tabs open at any one time. For the first year or two, he says he routinely labored 12 to 14 hours a day, but as the site grew and developed a following, his workday regularly swelled to 18 hours. It wasn't unusual to knock off at 4 a.m. and begin the routine all over again 5 hours later. I think he does outstanding work. Of course, the question, if these figures are true as to how hard he works on this site, how long will until the inevitable burn out? Philadelphia streets, this is from Citizen Free Press by Kane. Philadelphia streets look worse than San Francisco. Jack Posobiec has a video. Philly at night looks like Gotham City, and just the garbage everywhere. And that is a sign of civilizational collapse. And increasingly in Victoria, you see garbage everywhere. There's another bonus video taken this week, Streets of Philadelphia, true story. And looking at one of the women in this video, or both of them, I've noticed that a lot of homeless women seem to favor yoga pants, and just more and more garbage. Here's a story at uns.com, originally from American Renaissance by Gilbert Kavanaugh. Photos, Minneapolis after the riots. In 2013, I published a photo essay of Minneapolis that showed how foreign and non-white huge swaths of the city had become. Recently, I visited the city for the first time since the riots in 2020 and went back to Lake Street, a major road and the site of most of my 2013 photos. Things have gotten worse. 9 years ago, Lake Street was alien. The Black Lives Matter riots hit this part of town very hard, so today it's both alien and bombed out. There are many vacant lots and boarded up or destroyed stores. There are many vacant lots and boarded up stores in Victoria, downtown Victoria, and that number is increasing even as luxury condos go up literally a block or two away. That Victoria is clearly adopted the American model of, oh, this looks nice, and then you walk 1 block down the street Oh, this was a serious error. I'm scared now. Why don't they have warning signs? Hey, rich people, please stay in your compound. And I'm scrolling through, graffiti everywhere. Graffiti, of course, is a sign of destruction, but murals, lots and lots of murals. As I have said previously, murals are a signifier. And what they signify is you don't want to live here. Here's an amusing one from the front door of the Target that was looted and destroyed in 2020 to ensure the safety of our guests and team members. MLB, NFL, and NBA trading cards will no longer be sold in stores until further notice. Unlike 9 years ago, there is now trash everywhere. Oh, and here's some posters that say racism kills, and one that says kill cops, save lives, shoot back, avenge them, RIP Amir, RIP Amir Locke. I'm not familiar with that case. Oh, kick Proud Boys out of your neighborhood. Yes, they're the real problem. Oh, yes. The stores are still largely alien, mostly Hispanic and also African. Here's an ad. PaySii, SII. Promoted or powered by Safari Pay, the fast and easy way to send money to Somalia. Yes, bring Somalia to America, and guess what happens? Oh, they have a Somali museum of Minnesota. And much foreignness, much. Oh, here's a big mural of Frida Kahlo. These people, they're familiar with her work, are they? Or is she just the woman with the big hair and the flowers and the unibrow to them? And Aztec figures as well. Perhaps that religion is going to make a comeback, and now heavily Hispanic Minneapolis. Oh, share the love. Oh, and a clenched fist from what appears to be an 8-year-old black girl. Another mural. Murals. No. Again, stay away from areas that have murals. They are not good news. This was inevitable, but everyone denied that it was inevitable in my country, and they'll continue to deny it. Just as what happened in the Netherlands is inevitable, but let's not talk about that. This is from The Spectator by Yuan Yi Zhu. Why is Canada euthanizing the poor? Again, they're culling them when they're young and they're culling them when they're old. There is an endlessly repeated witticism by the poet Anatole France that the law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread. What France certainly did not foresee is that an entire country, and an ostentatiously progressive one at that, has decided to take his sarcasm at face value and to its natural conclusion. Since last year, Canadian law in all its majesty has allowed both the rich as well as the poor to kill themselves if they are both too poor to continue living with dignity. In fact, the ever-generous Canadian state will even pay for their deaths. What it will not do is spend money to allow them to live instead of killing themselves. As with most slippery slopes, it all began with a strongly worded denial that it exists. In 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada reversed 22 years of its own jurisprudence by striking down the country's ban on assisted suicide as unconstitutional, blithely dismissing fears that the ruling would initiate a descent down a slippery slope into homicide against the vulnerable as founded on anecdotal examples. The next year, Parliament duly enacted legislation allowing euthanasia, but only for those who suffer from a terminal illness whose natural death was reasonably foreseeable. It took 5 years for the proverbial slope to come into view when the Canadian Parliament enacted Bill C-7, a sweeping euthanasia law which repealed the reasonably foreseeable requirement and the requirement that condition be terminal. Now, as long as someone is suffering from an illness or disability which cannot be relieved under conditions that you consider acceptable, they can take advantage of what is now known euphemistically as medical assistance in dying, or MAID for short, for free. Soon enough, Canadians from across the country discovered that although they would otherwise prefer to live, they were too poor to improve their conditions to a degree which was acceptable. Not coincidentally, Canada has some of the lowest social care spending of any industrialized country. Palliative care is only accessible to a minority, and waiting times in the public health care sector can be unbearable, to the point where the same Supreme Court, which legalized euthanasia, declared those waiting times to be a violation of the right to life back in 2005. Palliative care. As far as I can see, palliative care is a means whereby difficult, old, sick people are killed off as quickly as possible in their hospices. Many in the healthcare sector came to the same conclusion even before Bill C-7 was enacted. Reports of abuse were rife. A man with a neurodegenerative disease testified to Parliament that nurses and a medical ethicist at the hospital tried to coerce him into killing himself by threatening to bankrupt him with extra costs, or by kicking him out of the hospital and by withholding water from him for 20 days. Virtually every disability rights group in the country opposed the new law, to no effect. For once, the government found it convenient to ignore these otherwise impeccably progressive groups. Since then, things have only gotten worse. A woman in Ontario was forced into euthanasia because her housing benefits did not allow her to get better housing, which didn't aggravate her crippling allergies. Another disabled woman applied to die because she simply couldn't afford to keep on living. Another sought euthanasia because COVID-related debt left her unable to pay for the treatment, which kept her chronic pain bearable. Under the present government, disabled Canadians got $600 in additional financial assistance during COVID. University students got $5,000. When the family of a 35-year-old disabled man who resorted to euthanasia arrived at the care home where he lived, they encountered urine on the floor, spots where there were feces on the floor, spots where your feet were just sticking. Like if you stood at his bedside and when you went to walk away, your foot was literally stuck. According to the Canadian government, the assisted suicide law is about prioritizing the individual autonomy of Canadians. One may wonder how much autonomy a disabled man lying in his own filth had in weighing death over life. Despite the Canadian government's insistence that assisted suicide is all about individual autonomy, it has also kept an eye on its fiscal advantages. Even before Bill C-7 entered into force, the country's parliamentary budget officer published a report about the cost savings it would create. Whereas the old MAID regime saved $86.9 million per year, a net cost reduction, in the sterile words of the report, Bill C-7 would create additional net savings of $62 million per year. Healthcare, particularly for those suffering from chronic conditions, is expensive, but assisted suicide only costs the taxpayer $2,327 per case. And of course, those who have to rely wholly on government-provided Medicare pose a far greater burden on the exchequer than those who have savings or private insurance. And yet, Canada's lavishly subsidized media, with some honorable exceptions, has expressed remarkably little curiosity about the open social murder of citizens in one of the world's wealthiest countries. Perhaps, like many doctors, journalists are afraid of being accused of being unprogressive for questioning the new culture of death, a fatal accusation in polite circles. Canada's public broadcaster, which in 2020 reassured Canadians that there was no link between poverty choosing medically assisted death, has had little to say about any of the subsequent developments. Next year, the floodgates will open even further when those suffering from mental illness, another disproportionately poor group, become eligible for assisted suicide, although enthusiastic doctors and nurses have already preempted the law. There's already talk of allowing mature minors access to euthanasia too. Just think of the lifetime savings. But remember, slippery slopes are always a fallacy. Well, there's another aspect to this, which this is an excellent piece. The author didn't consider, this is common like places like the Netherlands. Let's say your parents are old and sickly and cranky, and it is legal for them to experience the glories of physician-assisted murder. The pressure starts on them to kill themselves. Why are you being so selfish? Particularly if they have any money, in a will. We're not getting any younger here, and do you really want to be alive? Particularly since the children and grandchildren make it clear that they just see them as dollar signs. Think of all the resources that you're wasting here. Think of all of the people, nurses and the like. Do you think that this is right? I mean, you're kind of cheating on the welfare state by staying alive, aren't you? And of course, this is one of the great disadvantages of a socialized medicine, because effectively the state makes a claim to owning you. And let's go back to the chat. I should mention that one of the leaders in pushing for even more access to physician-assisted murder is Linda Frum, who was a senator and the sister of David Frum. Mama says KMG do 7 for Theater Thursday. I hate that movie. So no, I'm not going to do it. It's just, ooh, evil. Ooh, evil. Evil is irresistible. And let me show you evil in grotesque ways. One after another. Nobody here gets out alive, baby, says Brian Frakes. Yes, the immortal words of Jimbo Morrison. I'm still trying to purge all memory of that movie from my mind, said Oscar Toe. Richard Hell of television and his own band Fame, Blank Generation and the like, he wrote a review of it back when he used to do movie reviews. He just described how sickened he was by this film, and he just thought that it was puerile and prurient. Who else do we have? Christian Hines has a small part in Bruges. Lovely looking film with 2 gorgeous female actors. Again, yeah, I could talk about that, but I won't right now. Hiroshima is also a great jazz fusion group from the 1980s. Okay. Olivia Hussey as Mary. Yeah, a bit over the top there in the Jesus of Nazareth miniseries. Kahlo, just a tough broad with a mustache who almost certainly did not like white men, says a visionary companion. I had no idea the 1977 Jesus had a star-studded cast. It was also co-written, or the English parts of it were written by no less than Anthony Burgess. And it was Sir Lou Grade who was responsible for putting this together. And it got very good ratings. Robert Powell played the part of Jesus Christ, and he is simply astounding in it. Watching this, you can see just how powerful Christ was. I mean, filmmakers have typically been rather shy about depicting Jesus Christ, particularly, instances of righteous anger. Hello to Palcasso 88. And okay, so I am now going to talk about, it's always fun to see these stories. This is from Steve Watson at Summit News. A CNN talking head declared yesterday that if Elon Musk is allowed to buy Twitter, the platform will have to be government regulated to prevent discourse being open and free and not subject to establishment-controlled censorship. While discussing the Musk takeover on CNN's Potato Time with Brian Stelter, media analyst David Zarawik proclaimed that Musk is dangerous and shouldn't be allowed to restore free speech on the platform. Zarawik suggested that the U.S. look to Europe, which has recently brought in new laws to limit social media and even threatened to ban Twitter if Musk doesn't play ball. This is what he said. There's a bigger problem here about how we're going to control the channels of communications in this country. This is dangerous. We can't think anymore in this country. I'm serious. We don't have people in Congress who can make regulations that can make it work. I didn't make any of that up. The exclamation marks there. Yes. You need regulation. You cannot let these guys control discourse in this country, or we are headed to hell. He believes in hell, does he? We are there, he added, further claiming that Trump opened the gates of hell and now they're chasing us down. No, we control everything, but we're the ones who are being chased down. It's always projection with these people. Always. Always. But I don't know. They've been allowed to get away with it. They certainly don't like being mocked. So mock away. Speaking of disinformation, let's look at Jim Kunstler's column today. Since Elon Musk pounced on Twitter, are you not amazed to see just how dedicated to the suppression of speech the left is? Censorship is the left's very spark of life. Everything they stand for is so false and lawless that truth magnetically repels them. Now, this may surprise you, but truth and reality are joined at the hip. So when you work hard to suppress one, you are also stomping the face of the other. Disinformation just means anything the left doesn't want you to say out loud. The truth is that everything the left stands for these days is a kind of hustle, which is the cheap street version of a racket, meaning an effort to extract something of value from you dishonestly. It's the only way they know how to operate. It necessarily and chiefly depends on the deployment of lies, which by definition are propositions at odds with reality. The more they traffic in lies, the further they must distance themselves from reality and try to coerce you to go along with ever more absurdity, mostly peaceful riots, men with ovaries, something elections, insurrection, conspiracy theories, Leah Thomas in the fast lane, safe and effective vaccines. Believe it or else. Kunstler continues, the left ends up at war with reality. That adds up to a bad business model for running a society, and the results are now plain to see. What in the USA is not failing these days? Our Potemkin economy of nail parlors, porn sites, Pizza Huts, casinos, drugs, and helicopter money, our reckless relations with other countries, public and higher education, medicine, financial markets, the sputtering engine of government under a phantom president. It's all sinking into chaos and incoherence. For now, food just costs more than ever. Wait until it's simply unavailable. Nobody will care about anything else after that. All this failure requires cover stories, narratives. Russia did it. COVID-19 did it. White supremacists did it. Trump did it. Narrative failure would equal failure of the left altogether, so the left requires the sturdiest possible apparatus for suppressing counter-narratives that lean in the direction of reality, its enemy. The left found that apparatus in social media, the new vehicle for political debate, especially Twitter, which was so easily, blatantly, and dishonestly manipulated backstage by mysterious code ninjas. Twitter enjoys subsidy relations with government that incline it to do the government's bidding. In effect, the government enlisted Twitter to undermine and override Americans' First Amendment protections by proxy. Now we have the Disinformation Governance Board to be run by a TikTok musical comedy star, Nina Jankowicz, an instant laughingstock who's been retailing disinformation. That has been her whole occupation in the scant years she's been on the deep state scene. Jankowicz is a notorious Russiagate hoaxer and PSYOP agent in the October 2020 emergence of Hunter Biden's laptop. She has zero credibility as anything but a professional falsifier. Her Disinfo Governance Board has no authority to regulate anything. It's just a lame charade that can only draw more attention to the left's hatred of truth and reality. The left pretends that free speech is a threat to civilization because, as usual, they are projecting psychologically. Their world is a mirror. In fact, the left is a threat to civilization. If Biden is still on the scene in January next year, he'll be the first president not only impeached but convicted and removed by the Senate. And if for some reason he avoids criminal prosecution for treason out of some pitiful need for the government to maintain official decorum for the rest of the world, his brothers and his degenerate son may not be so lucky. As you may have heard, Nina Jankowicz is a Renaissance woman, and she used to write erotic Harry Potter songs. This was some years ago, 7-8 years ago, something like that. Now, and songs about what she'd like to do with Harry's wand. Get it? Correct me if I'm wrong. Aren't most of the characters in the Harry Potter novels children? Why is this woman eroticizing children? Of course, that seems to be something that a great many people are doing these days. There was an essay in American Greatness by Victor Davis Hanson, called The New Disinformationists. Yes, we just woke up one day and there's a whole industry called Disinformation and Misinformation Inc., which is heavily supported by governments and by so-called NGOs, which in turn are heavily supported by governments. The Biden administration feels that it must now use federal resources to attack so-called disinformation. So the Department of Homeland Security recently announced the creation of a disinformation governance board. The board's executive director, Nina Jankowicz, at least has clear qualifications for the post. She previously had spread false rumors on social media that Donald Trump voters would show up at the polls in 2020 armed and joined the mob's chorus that Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian disinformation. Perhaps the idea behind her hiring was it takes one to know one. Although new board's mandate is unclear, the idea seems to be that Jankowicz and her colleagues will use the federal government's powers to adjudicate what Americans say as either true or false, and to suppress as disinformation anything it doesn't find useful. The new war against disinformation follows the narratives of the insurrection, so-called, on January 6th, the democracy dies in darkness return of Donald Trump, and Vladimir Putin as a mastermind gasoline price spiker. Such narratives are intended to distract us from the Biden disaster and the ongoing assault against constitutional freedom. When things turned south for the administration, Barack Obama, a sagging Netflix $50 million idea man, usually emerges from one of his three mansions in Hawaii, Martha's Vineyard, or Kalorama to lecture clingers and deplorables on various threats they pose to the anointed. His sermons usually project his own transgressions. Recently, Obama went to Stanford University in the heart of Silicon Valley to admonish us that new free speech platforms might tolerate incorrect expression that he and the left smear as hate speech. But is not Barack Obama ill-suited to lecture anyone on disinformation? Do we remember his Obamacare version of disinformation? You can keep your doctor, you can keep your plan. Do we recall shovel-ready jobs? Obama was caught secretly promising Russian leader Dmitry Medvedev that the United States would deal away missile defense in Eastern Europe for Vladimir Putin's good behavior. During his 2012 re-election bid, was this transparency or another example of how, for a hot mic, democracy dies in darkness? Who employed the misinformationist Christopher Steele to slander presidential candidate Donald Trump? Was it James Comey's FBI or Hillary Clinton's campaign or the Democratic National Committee or the Perkins Coie legal firm or Fusion GPS or all combined? And which president was briefed regularly on his administration's disinformation war against Trump? For that matter, which media company banned any coverage of the Hunter Biden laptop story? Jeff Bezos' Washington Post, Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook, Jack Dorsey's Twitter, or all of them? Projection is a left-wing trademark. What it accuses in others reveals what it seeks to hide within itself. So when we hear Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas announcing this war on disinformation, we suspect that he is our master disinformationist. Is it not his agency that is airlifting illegal aliens in the dead of night to regional airports rather than transparently in the light of day? Is that disinformation dies in darkness? What happened to the Biden administration's furious charges that the Mounted Border Patrol was whipping innocent illegal aliens? When a federal investigation cleared the accused, did Mayorkas correct his own disinformation and apologize? Yeah. To ask the question is to answer it. Who should we expect next to lecture the nation on the dangers of disinformation? A paroled and once leftist heartthrob, Michael Avenatti, Joe Biden himself, on his own supposed ignorance of Hunter's cronies, CNN and MSNBC on Hunter Biden's Russian disinformation laptop? Will Anthony Fauci weigh in on the non-existence of federal funding for gain-of-function research at Wuhan? Will Robert Mueller reemerge to restate yet again that he never knew anything of the Steele dossier? Will James Comey go back under oath to claim another 240 times he cannot remember? Will John Brennan lie a third time under oath before Congress, James Clapper a second time, or Andrew McCabe mislead a fourth federal investigator? What about those 51 former intelligence officials who convinced voters before the election that Hunter's laptop was Russian disinformation? Would Nina Jankowicz rule their letter of expertise information, misinformation, or disinformation? Or perhaps we could hear warnings of organized misinformation from those blue chip 17 Nobel Prize winning economists who vouched in a letter that Biden's massive Build Back Better plan would not contribute to inflation that was indeed already ignited and beginning to blow up the economy. Oh, yes. In the category of journalists are Stasi creeps, here we have one, Justin Baragona, who is with the Daily Beast. Fox News host Rachel Campos Duffy boasted Sunday morning she and co-host Pete Hegseth are unvaccinated, despite the fact that the network's parent company requires that all New York City employees provide proof of vaccination to work in person. The declaration Sunday morning, which on the surface seems to place both on-air personalities in violation of both corporate and city policy, came as they tried to push back on Joe Biden's joke about the network's vaccine hypocrisy. During the White House Correspondents' Dinner Saturday night, the president garnered perhaps his biggest laughs of the evening when he took a swipe at the conservative network, pointing out that to attend the event, everyone had to prove they had their COVID-19 shots. How is that a joke? Here's the whole joke. Everyone had to prove they are fully vaccinated and boosted. So if you're at home watching this and you are wondering how to do that, just contact your favorite Fox News reporter. They're all here, vaccinated and boosted, all of them. You see, this is, one might call it disinformation. Oh, Fox News is fanatically anti-vax. No, it is not. There are elements on Fox News opposed to compulsory vaccination. Those are two very different positions. And, oh, yes, you've heard of the term globo homo, right? And globo homo, of course, is a wicked, vile conspiracy theory. But is it? This is from Alex Parker at Red State. Transgender revolutionary Joe Biden is advancing the human rights of alphabet persons around the world. The best I can tell, inclusivity now means special endorsement. If no one ever said anything in society within institutions, everyone would still be included. But these days we are told we must be inclusive by way of particular recognition. So goes the evolution of language. Apropos of such a change, the Biden administration released a report last month on its promotion of transgenderism across the product. The announcement boasted a first. Today, the U.S. government released a first-of-its-kind progress report on implementation of President Biden's memorandum on advancing the human rights of alphabet persons around the world. The progress demonstrates the U.S. commitment to promoting and protecting the human rights of alphabet people around the world through our diplomacy and foreign assistance. Advancing inclusive democracy. During the Summit for Democracy, the U.S. supported a statement from the Equal Rights Coalition on Democracy and Alphabet People Rights, which affirms that promoting and protecting the human rights of alphabet persons is essential for, wait for it, democratic renewal. Democracy is gay. As part of the Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal, the State Department also committed up to $5 million to launch the Global Alphabet People Inclusive Democracy and Empowerment Fund, which is the acronym GLIDE. Ooh, I don't know. A little bit of trolling going on there. And okay, let's talk about the fellow who's running the Ukraine, who is ostensibly running the Ukraine. He is a man called Vladimir Zelensky. Can't use the 26th letter of the Latin alphabet because it's being outlawed everywhere. As we know, Zelensky was a comedian, part of a troupe, and he starred in something called Servant of the People, and then a very strange thing happened. It was about an honest politician in the Ukraine, and an oligarch called Ihor Kolomoisky decided that this comedian, Zelensky, was going to be the president of Ukraine. And so it happened. And of course, Kolomoisky is also the person who bankrolled the infamous Nazi Azov battalion. Strange bedfellows in the Ukraine. But I've been thinking about what I saw some tweet today about now, how would I put it? Zelensky votive candles have become very popular. Are people praying to Zelensky now? Are they worshiping him? And it reminded something that I'd seen in my own country a few years ago with regard to Justin Trudeau. I can think of no better way to describe this than a psychosexual frenzy. We saw a similar thing with Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, in 1968. And I witnessed this, and I was rather surprised because Pierre Trudeau was a hideously ugly, pockmarked, balding man. But something called Trudeau mania arose, which was completely organic and not ginned up by the media at all. Of course, the media is much more powerful now than it was in 1968. And it seemed that the female component of the Canadian media, which is numerous, they harbored very strong, powerful sexual feelings for Justin Trudeau. And it seemed to me that much of the male component of the Canadian media also harbored strong sexual feelings for Justin Trudeau as well. And we see the same thing with Zelensky. The cult of this man can scarcely be believed, and the intensity of it. And do you know that he wears a hoodie, an olive hoodie, and he wears an olive T-shirt? As someone joked on Twitter. Oh yes, it was Blowhard Esquire. Notice how he's always dressed casually. That lets you know he's a regular guy just like you. How much money does Zelensky have? Does he have $1 billion? Does he have $900 million? $100 million? Less than that, substantially less than that. No one disputes the fact that he is rich. Again, how one gets to be rich as a comedian in the Ukraine is a question that no one is asking. No one at all, because it would be a very embarrassing question, despite the fact that The Guardian, a couple of years ago, disclosed the fact that Zelensky had secret bank accounts, offshore bank accounts. And I guess that sounds like he's pretty wealthy. Does it not? Besides the psychosexual frenzy, we're living through World War kitsch. Oh, let's talk about the Ghost of Truth now. Paul Joseph Watson has a video. They did it again. The Ghost of Kiev, the claim that a crack Ukrainian fighter pilot had shot down dozens of Russian fighter jets, widely acknowledged to be a hoax when it first circulated back at the end of February. But over the weekend, the legacy media tried to resurrect it again. And there you were thinking Adam Kinzinger falling for a Photoshop meme of Sam Hyde would have put the story to bed, or the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense tweeting out a video it claimed to show the Ghost of Kiev, yet was swiftly revealed to be from a flight simulator, would have discredited it for good. But they're so desperate to manufacture phony narratives surrounding this conflict, they've just refused to lie down. And now it's back. The Kiev Post identity of legendary Ukrainian Ghost of Kiev. Oh, yes. Killed defending the Ukraine sites on March the 13th. Oh, that's sad. 40 Russian aircraft. Wow. Dozens of legacy media outlets were once again pushing the Ghost of Kiev hoax. The Ukrainian military itself confirmed the story to be manufactured. The information about the death of the Ghost of Kiev is incorrect. The Ghost of Kiev is alive. He embodies the collective spirit of the highly qualified pilots of the Tactical Aviation Brigade who are successfully defending Kyiv. in the region. In other words, it's a unifying propaganda myth, Watson says. Tarabalka's death was reported on back in March. There was no mention then of the Ghost of Kiev or any confirmation of his kill count, not to mention the complete impossibility that one person shooting down 40 different fighter jets. So that didn't stop a New York Post, Ghost of Kiev killed in battle post. Heroic Ghost of Kiev, a fighter, doesn't actually exist, Ukraine admits. Whoops. I don't care if it's fake, it's the message that counts. The BBC subsequently admitted, quote, but now the Ukraine Air Force commanders warned on Facebook that the Ghost of Kiev is a superhero legend whose character was created by Ukrainians. The Ghost of Kiev was a collective image of pilots of the Air Force's 40th Tactical Aviation Brigade who defend the sky over the capital rather than a single man's combat record. Ukrainian military historian Mikhail Zihorov described the Ghost of Kiev story as, quote, propaganda for raising morale. And while admitting that the whole thing was propaganda, deliberate disinformation, what headline did the BBC choose to run with? How Ukraine's Ghost of Kiev legendary pilot was born. He doesn't even exist. So the whole thing was fabricated from the start, yet the media is still pushing it 2 months later. The story's gone viral on social media multiple times, and where are the fact checkers? As Chris Menahan writes, not one single news outlet which ran with this host will get banned from social media or algorithmically censored by Google for spreading it. No one will be downgraded by NewsGuard. No one will be demonetized, and no one will lose their PayPal account credit processor. Such treatment is reserved only for those who tell the truth. Where's Biden's new disinformation czar? Where are all the online disinformation experts? I'll tell you, where AWOL, because when the disinformation benefits the regime, it not only goes unchecked, they relentlessly amplify this disinformation. It's okay when we do it, Watson concludes. Well, if universal falsehood could be monetized, the Ukraine would be the richest country on earth. Hoax after hoax after hoax after hoax. And it doesn't seem to matter. This is from Jackie Sallow of the New York Post. Heroic Ghost of Kiev fighter doesn't actually exist, Ukraine admits. And I'm scrolling down here to find a groveling apology from the New York Post. And I'm scrolling. I keep scrolling here. I know they're buying into the news story. Oh, it's a collective myth, so that's a good thing. And it ends with this paragraph. True or not, this is exactly the kind of inspiring story the Résistance needs right now, a user said on Twitter. Yes, the ghost of truth. Here's a mystery reported on by Michael Tracy at his Substack. On April 17th, I was in London Bridge train station in central London and couldn't help but notice that the entire station was blanketed with these digital Be Brave Like Ukraine ads. Stylized in a nifty semi-Cyrillic font, the ads feature the classic blue and yellow color scheme that has now become so ubiquitous across the so-called West, perhaps most prominently in London, where a local acquaintance told me she's seen more Ukraine flags on display over the past 2 months than she ever saw of the UK's own national flag. And there are many pictures here. Tracy continues, I had a few natural questions upon seeing these ads. First, who crafted them? That answer came quickly. Just go to brave.ua website and you'll discover the ads were crafted by a consortium within the Ukraine government, including the office of Zelensky and the cabinet of ministers of Ukraine and the Ministry of Digital Transformation. That sounds sinister, doesn't it? The answer to other natural questions have not come so quickly, though. Those questions include who paid for these ads, how much did they cost, who organized their placement in some of the most expensive advertising real estate in the world. They've also been displayed in Times Square, among other high-profile locations. Strangely, this information has proven difficult to acquire. First, I tried querying the TfL, the government body in charge of transport in London. They had no clue about the ads. Then I tried Network Rail, which runs most of the railways in England. They had no clue either. Finally, I tried the massive global advertising agency, which apparently owns the digital screens in question, JC Decay. And it initially seemed like they might have the answer. I know this because the corporate communications director for JCDecaux inadvertently sent me an email where she deliberates with her colleague about how to answer my questions. This is from a woman called Clementine Pratt. Unfortunate name in England, where Pratt means a bumbling idiot. Thank you, Janet. I agree we need another statement. Do you know who is the advertiser? Is it an association or the Ukrainian government? Let's talk about this tomorrow. Best regards, Clementine. And then she followed this up with her email. Dear Mr. Tracy, please take note that my last message was due to be addressed to someone else. I'm waiting for some information. I will come back to you tomorrow. Tracy comments, kind of funny that the corporate communications director still doesn't have the hang of communication skills, like sending your sensitive internal emails to the right recipient. Either way, this person did not, in fact, come back to me tomorrow. Days passed and I heard nothing. Then finally, here was the answer. Dear Mr. Tracy, thank you for your inquiry, but we do not wish to comment. Best regards, Clementine Pratt. Curious, don't you think? Why would a multinational advertising conglomerate based in France with branches in the UK, US, and elsewhere be so skittish about providing basic details about this Ukraine government advertising campaign? Shouldn't they be proud of it and therefore happy to provide the details? I thought the message of the ads was to be brave like Ukraine. Apparently, that bravery doesn't extend to allowing for transparency in the financial arrangements of these PR maneuvers, which have resulted in Western capitals being saturated with imagery that to the naked eye may seem benign, but functionally amounts to obvious pro-war propaganda. Because bear in mind that these government-crafted ads have flooded London, New York City, Washington, D.C., etc., at the same time as Ukrainian officials are furiously lobbying the UK and US governments to ramp up their military involvement in the war. Those lobbying efforts have been incredibly successful, with respectable mainstream outfits like the New Yorker finally now admitting that the scale of the US commitment constitutes, quote, a full proxy war with Russia, unquote. Not so long ago, Tracy reports, I was attacked as a peddler of Putin's talking points for using the term proxy war on a TV. It went largely unremarked upon when the head of the Pentagon, flanked by the head of the State Department, transited into Kiev for a secret mission April 25th, and then hours later, a series of giant explosions ripped through a Russian military logistics hub approximately 90 miles inside Russia. This after U.S. officials began leaking that they would no longer even pretend to recognize any distinction between defensive and offensive combat operations conducted by the Ukraine military, effectively acknowledging their willingness to provide both weaponry and real-time intelligence to launch attacks on Russia itself. With each passing week, both the United States and the United Kingdom adopt a more and more aggressive, bombastic war footing. The propaganda campaign by the Ukraine government has been demonstrably effective, and the ad agency, which facilitated the ads, is choosing to conceal from the public basic details about their provenance, such as who even paid for them. Really makes you think. Oh, and about that New Yorker piece, this is by Robin Wright. Ukraine is now America's war, too. Oh, doesn't that make everyone in America feel warm and cuddly? Die for Hunter Biden. That's a catchy slogan. The U.S. is leading a new coalition of, quote, nations of goodwill as the goal expands from supporting Ukraine to weakening Russia, weakening and outlasting Putin. There's something about someone crying here. Some U.S. official crying or coming close to tears. Okay. Does that sound like, who are these people? Who are these people? Honestly, that this is, a high official of the United States government talks about, claims, agitprop from the Ukrainian government, and tears up. Oh, yeah, here we go. Here's the quotation. On Friday, Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby choked up at a briefing as he discussed Putin's depravity. Choked up. How about that? Huh? But what do we know about this Robin Wright woman? Obviously, she's not the actress. This is a different Robin Wright. She's written for the New Yorker since 1988. And she has a Twitter account, of course. And she has interesting things to say about Madeleine Albright because the word depravity was used. All right. And I guess Madeleine Albright, she was a kick-ass chick, huh? And so we all like Madeleine Albright, right? My PBS NewsHour interview on Madeleine Albright about her life, times, and incredible contributions as the first most powerful woman in American history. This is a woman who said publicly on 60 Minutes, interviewed by Leslie Stahl, that U.S. sanctions against Iraq had led to, this was the claim, the death of 500,000 children. Now, some people dispute that the number was that high, that a large number of children died because of the result of these sanctions. Years ago, I wrote a story about sanctions, and I could not get anyone to pin down exactly what was sanctioned, because the media was not particularly interested in that. But she was asked by Leslie Stahl about this. I mean, people are holding you responsible for 500,000 deaths of innocents. Okay. And we think the price is worth it. That's what Madeleine Albright said. Very hard choice. Yes, we have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And is the price worth it? I think this is a very hard choice. But we think the price is worth it. Well, I don't like to make judgments on someone's soul and where it ends up. But I have to think that unless there was an enormous amount of contrition from Madeleine Albright, not that we saw any, she is burning in hell now. Anwin says, I'd like to think Putin has a close advisor just like Malkovich's Teddy, KGB from Rounders. Yes. Very aggressive, Vlad. Pure damn evil, says Gamion. Mere cattle, says Brian Frakes. Gamion says, was thinking the same. She is burning. Oh, this is good. I like this. David the Gnome says, have there been any Marvel Universe Ukraine crossover promotions? I saw one of Star Wars. Oh, okay. Do scorpions show contrition? Asked Birkin Sultanov. Yes, apparently Putin is guilty of depravity and war crimes. 500,000 innocent children. Apparently that's not depravity. That's not a war crime. I know that a lot of Americans, many of them good-hearted Americans who express distress and amusement at the fact that America is hated in many places in the world. Well, I mean, you can look at what the Russians are being accused of. No one is accusing them of killing 500,000 total people, let alone civilians, let alone children. But no, Madeleine Albright, she was a tough woman. And she was a woman, so that makes her even better than a man. But Putin, just depraved. Jokin666 says, I love people who keep posting pics of Asiatic Russian forces as if that would end right support. Russia has a lot of Asia in it. I wonder how many people actually know that. I wonder how many know that. Ivan doesn't flinch. It's the Viking in him, says Birkin Sultanov. Oh, yes, we've had a lot of essays about, Russia, you're not even a culture, not even a country. Do you know who founded you? It was the Ukrainians and Vikings. Yeah, okay. All right. All righty. I think they've lost the public on this Ukraine business. Nobody cares about it anymore, says Oscar Toe. KMG's eye has become stronger than it was before, says David the Gnome. Oh, is that a metaphor? Kitsch. This is World War kitsch. And it just seems to get worse every day, at least on Twitter. Of course, one wonders how much of this is, shall we say, sponsored? Burkin Sultanov says, I've seen videos of Chechen soldiers dancing among the ruins. Do they dance like they do on the HBO series Barry? Amusing. Anrun says, Milan Kundera, kitsch causes 2 tears to flow in quick succession. The first tear says, how nice to see children running on the grass. The second tear says, how nice to be moved altogether with all mankind by children running on the grass. It is the second tear that makes kitsch. And here's another essay by friend of the live stream, Frank Wright. Freedom of speech in wartime. Humpty can't keep it together. And he's got a little illustration here with speech bubbles. And there's a doctor, psychologist, or therapist or something examining a woman who has her head in her hands. And he says, sorry, but I have to ask you this. Are these winning Ukrainians with us in the room right now? To step back from the looking glass, Wright begins, the regime is in serious decline. The United States has failed to force regime change in Kazakhstan, Belarus, and in Russia. The ruble is now perhaps the strongest currency in the world, Russia awash with cash. The sanctions pressed by the U.S. threaten to destroy Europe and condemn it to permanent stagflation, a fact announced by the Financial Times this week. The U.S. has squandered what seemed to be an unchallengeable global dominance in this last reckless gambit, a war which it forced by its own deliberate brinksmanship and one which it is losing on the ground and on the airwaves. Chaos at home and abroad is the new normal. And here's a quote from Edward Bernays, who was Sigmund Freud's, was his nephew? Was it? Something like that. But he was related to Sigmund Freud. He is the founder of public relations. You can learn all about him in one of Adam Curtis's BBC documentaries. Organizing chaos. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. Unquote. Of all the wars it has lost in the last 70 years, all of them, this is by far the most damaging. It is a war that ended in 1989 with the fall of communism, and it has taken them 30 years to lose it despite the odds. It has staked everything on this one only to be staring failure in the face. For the regime, this is an existential matter. If it is seen to lose again, it will be utterly discredited, having staked everything on a gambit which appears to have failed. The regime has lied to you about everything concerning Ukraine, just as it has presented a bizarre distortion of reality in practically every other issue of note for the past several years. I do not think it can recover from such a tremendous loss of face as presented by the sudden revelation that it has fabricated a completely false narrative on the scale of that scene over Ukraine. The narrative about the war, which has been packaged for our consumption, is one which cannot account for the return to nation-state politics. With the sudden collapse of communism, which no intelligence agency predicted, the U.S. found itself the world's only superpower. Aside from the tragedy of this squandered opportunity to build on the peace dividend, a phrase we never seem to hear anymore, the United States enjoyed a period of perhaps 32 years of unchallenged global supremacy. No one refused to pick up the phone to the U.S. as they do now. It is a cruel accident of fate that the neoconservatives, a fringe group of former Trotskyites, happened to be adjacent to U.S. power at a time it required some new, invigorating idea to guide its policy through an extraordinary moment of unipolarity. The peace dividend was supposed to be the benefit of the new era of cooperation and friendship, which was to replace the Cold War. It was to be derived precisely from the elimination of enormous military budgets inflated by the arms race between NATO and the Soviet Union. The money was supposed instead to be spent on improving your life at home. The current U.S. Secretary of Defense serves on the board of Raytheon, one of the world's largest arms manufacturers. Oh, apparently Lockheed Martin sells rainbow socks. Socks feature rainbow pride colors with the Lockheed Martin logo along the top, made from 100% polyester with an elastic band. What followed instead of global security was a succession of wars. The next one, whose trailer we're all watching now, will be a similar exercise in handling dividends to the military-industrial complex whilst stimulating economic collapse throughout Europe and the wider world. There is no plan as to what is to come next once war is achieved, nor is there any interest in addressing the combination of inflation and recession known as stagflation. The neoconservative faction, which directs U.S. foreign policy and therefore that of most NATO countries, has never been interested in the economic consequences of its actions. Frank Wright continues, the actions of the U.S. are simply the actions of a nation-state attempting to preserve its interests. With the current faction controlling U.S. NATO foreign policy, the interpretation of interest means asserting U.S. dominance by military force. It is, of course, a disastrous, if for some lucrative policy, which has led to the destruction of many nations and the reinvigoration of the enemies of the U.S. in every war it has fought since NATO was founded. Russia, too, is no innocent. Nations are not innocent. Their interests are pursued by their governments according to those governments' understanding of what their national interest is at the time. It is noteworthy that the co-founder of the neoconservative Project for the New American Century, Robert Kagan, admits that the policies of the U.S. inspired by his faction did in fact provoke Russia to invade Ukraine. He wrote, quote, although it is obscene to blame the United States for Putin's inhumane attack on Ukraine, to insist that the invasion was entirely unprovoked is misleading. Just as Pearl Harbor was the consequence of U.S. efforts to blunt Japanese expansion on the Asian mainland, and just as the 9/11 attacks were partly a response to the United States' dominant presence in the Middle East after the first Gulf War, so Russian decisions have been a response to the expanding post-Cold War hegemony of the United States and its allies in Europe. Putin alone is to blame for his actions, but the invasion of Ukraine is taking place in a historical and geopolitical context in which the United States has played and still plays the principal role, and Americans must grapple with this fact, unquote. Oh, and then there's two more illustrations. Thomas Jefferson says, when injustice becomes law, resistance becomes duty. And then Mark Zuckerberg responds, your post has been removed because it doesn't follow our community guidelines. We have now returned to the state of global affairs, which sees nation states acting independently of a single power bloc to serve their own interests. The war in Ukraine, in Russia doing so, the proxy war waged by the U.S. and its client states is likewise an expression of that nation's interest. Neither of these actions is morally good, and neither side is on yours. This is politics on the state level. It has nothing to do with your interests, and the power struggle between nations will be presented to you in simple emotional terms matched to symbols. You may adopt these symbols in order to feel good about yourself, to feel part of something, to feel you are doing something. These symbols and the simplified moral narrative they represent are created to be easily attached to your emotions so that anyone who does not display them nor support them makes you feel bad, as if you've been attacked personally. The cruel irony is that the use of these symbols and their widespread adoption by ordinary people makes it far more likely that you will indeed be attacked personally. This is not an outcome which any sane person in possession of these facts would welcome. This is the reason free speech is to be feared. Free speech is not just a problem for Twitter employees. Twitter is, like all the big tech companies, an arm of the U.S. government intelligence community. The information monopolies are places where the acceptable version of reality is manufactured. Without censorship and punishment, they can no longer function as intended to control the population without force. This has always been the purpose of Bernays' engineered consent. The United States government has created a disinformation governance board, which is to combat Russian so-called misinformation of the build-up to war. This comes as Twitter is taken over by a self-declared free speech champion and mirrors the establishment of the Committee on Public Information, which Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann, among others, used to propagandize the U.S. population into both world wars. The United States routinely suspends free speech in a time of war. It is also quite normal to create some ministry of truth in wartime to secure a uniformity of messaging or propaganda. Here is the new head of Biden's Disinformation Governance Board singing a happy propaganda song. This makes the move towards free speech on Twitter an astonishing break with state power and policy, which may conclude with the sanctioning and prosecution of Twitter's new owner. Elon Musk is not a superhero, though he is heroically reckless if he does not recognize he is staking his life against a system which cannot survive without censorship and propaganda. The regime is real, and it favors these means of dominating its populations whilst maintaining an appearance of moral legitimacy. refusing open repression in favor of limits on speech. It governs by coercion through relentless and intrusive propaganda. Its policing favors the insane and the unstable. Its memes appeal to those whose minds it is already broken. And he concludes, Frank Wright concludes, the regime is absolutely corrupt and has no legitimacy, moral, political, or otherwise. It is literally bankrupt. Our birthright has not been sold for a mess of pottage. It has been squandered in a mess which soon might get much, much worse. And I am now going to move on to, oh, yes. What are you doing in the Ukraine? Part 1. This is from Bonchi at Red State. In April, MSNBC's intelligence analyst extraordinaire Malcolm Nance decided to take his LARPing to the next level by going to fight in the Ukraine. You may recall Nance as being a rabidly anti-Trump figure throughout the last administration. Back in May 2021, he proclaimed a coming Trump-led terrorist and paramilitary insurgency. But as is true with essentially everything Nance says, he missed the mark by a mile and no such thing has materialized. Why? Because Nance is the biggest poser in media, constantly fluffing his resume and making it seem as if he were some former super spy with immense expertise in military warfare. Nothing could be further from the truth, and he's often beclowned himself with wild proclamations and predictions. In regards to going to Ukraine, Nance made an appearance on Joy Reid's ridiculous show in which he cosplays as an operator, ready to take the fight to the Russians. He also took to social media to put out the same vibes. I'm done talking, he tweeted. Ooh, tough guy. So what has Nance been up to? Has he been unloading on Putin soldiers at the front lines, which is the facade he's tried to put up? Nah, it appears he's not actually fighting at all. Instead, he's hiding out in safe houses and talking to the press, likely of his own volition. It's hard to quantify the level of stolen valor and arrogance mixed up in all of this. There are real people dying in Ukraine fighting the Russians, indeed. But put on that flag button, and just talk up Zelensky. That's just as good as fighting, right? Is this the first war in history where one side believes that it can actually meme itself into victory? And noted ghoul Angelina Jolie made a surprise visit to the Ukraine during the Russian invasion. Doesn't she have enough children from foreign countries? Again, from Kane at Citizen Free Press, Angelina Jolie runs for cover in the Ukraine. And there's a video here, and there's an awful lot of running in the streets with no cover. As people pointed out, it would seem to be safer to head into the buildings rather than be out there on the streets. Wittgenstein tweeted, Angelina Jolie is in Ukraine. She is the second Hollywood celebrity after Sean Penn to visit the country since the start of the Russian military operation. It would be difficult for me to express, in a brief period of time, just how crazy Angelina Jolie is. So I suppose you'll just have to take my word for it. Now, this is a strange controversy, which is Ukraine related. Hashtag Zelensky is Jewish was trending on Twitter. I suppose there's two ways you can look at this. For people who don't like Jews, this is confirmation. For people who like Jews or are Jews themselves, then that makes Zelensky a Jewish hero. And I think the second explanation is the correct one. This is from the Daily Beast. Barbie Latsa Nadeau. That is quite the name. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has sparked outrage in Israel after telling the Italian television news program Zona Bianca that even Adolf Hitler had Jewish blood. Lavrov, largely unchecked by host Giuseppe Brindisi, went on to blame Western media for misinterpreting the facts of his boss Vladimir Putin's deadly special operation in Ukraine. He repeated the lies that Russian forces had only hit military targets and that the Bucha massacre was a staged event. Oh, do we have the report? Do we have the several hundred-page report with all the evidence? that these claims made by the Daily Beast are correct? No, of course we don't. It is, it's the argument from authority. When asked how Ukraine could be denazified when its president, Vladimir Zelensky, is Jewish, Lavrov replied, so what if Zelensky is Jewish? The fact does not negate the Nazi elements in Ukraine. I believe that Hitler also had Jewish blood, and in fact, some of the worst anti-Semites are Jews. The comment drew scorn from Danny Dayan, head of Israel's Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum, who called his comments false, delusional, and dangerous, and worthy of condemnation. Conspiracy theorists have long pushed the lie that Hitler was in fact Jewish, but scholars have debunked the notion. Okay. There are various explanations of what it means to be Jewish. There is a religious definition, which is pretty straightforward. And then there are ethnic explanations, which are complicated, particularly as outer marriage of Jews continues to increase. It has been postulated again and again over decades that Adolf Hitler had some Jewish blood. And if he did, so what? There's a lot of racial mixing in Central Europe at the time that Hitler was born. And there are a great many people who were Catholic or Lutheran who had some Jewish blood. Again, this is from historyonthenet.com. Was Hitler Jewish? For someone so obsessed with ethnic cleansing and ancestry, Hitler was quite vague about his own descent. None of these rumors have been proved true beyond doubt. Hitler was definitely not a Jew in the true sense of the word, but there is a faint possibility that one of his ancestors might have been Jewish. There is the paternal grandfather theory, the DNA test theory. I don't think that it is particularly important. Actually, I do not think it is particularly important, but it's amusing for me to see people start screaming hysterically at the very suggestion. As to the idea of self-hating Jews, are there all that many of them? Let's see. Bobby Fischer, who was officially half Jewish, and he was actually all Jewish because the man that he was told was his father was not his father, and it seems pretty certain that Bobby Fischer knew that he was ethnically 100% Jewish. He really hated Jews. Just the vitriol coming from him about the Jews and cheering on the 9/11 attacks, etc., etc. Yes. Also, but Bobby Fischer was a strange man that he found himself, after his downfall in Hungary. And he stayed with the Polgar family, the father and the three lovely sisters who were fine chess players. And Bobby Fischer kept going on, about his hatred of Jews. And finally, Papa Polgar had to remind him, we're Jewish, right? Bobby, he left or was kicked out of the place. The musician and political agitator Gilad Atzmon, who is a Jew born in Israel, I have read some of his stuff, which is rather like, I believe I described it in the past as hearing a highly intelligent but somewhat disturbed man shouting into your ear from point blank distance. Gilad Atzmon, I think it would be fair to call him an anti-Semite. If anyone can think of other self-hating Jews, well, I suppose you can put it in the chat. But again, we're going to adjudicate Hitler's race now? I mean, he was born in 1889 and died in 1945, and that's 55 plus 20. That's 77 years ago. But again, he's one of those figures that the further we get away from him, the more importance he assumes. We are going back to Joseph Tainter and the collapse of complex societies. This is Chapter 5, Evaluation, Complexity, and Marginal Returns in Collapsing Societies. The framework developed in the preceding chapter focused on changing cost-benefit ratios for investment in complexity. The shift to increasing complexity, undertaken initially to relieve stress or realize an opportunity, is at first a rational, productive strategy that yields a favorable marginal return. Typically, however, continued stresses, unanticipated challenges, and the costliness of socio-political integration combine to lower this marginal return. As the marginal return on complexity declines, complexity as a strategy yields comparatively lower benefits at higher and higher costs. A society that cannot counter this trend, such as through acquisition of an energy subsidy, becomes vulnerable to stress surges that it is too weak or impoverished to meet, and to waning support in its population. With continuation of this trend, collapse becomes a matter of mathematical probability, as over time an insurmountable stress surge becomes increasingly likely. Until such a challenge occurs, there may be a period of economic stagnation, political decline, and territorial shrinkage. The ideal way to evaluate this model would be to isolate and quantify the costs and benefits of various instances of social complexity, and to plot changes in these costs and benefits through time. Long-term periods of significantly declining marginal returns in complexity should be periods of vulnerability to collapse. None of the ancient societies that have collapsed, however, have kept the kinds of detailed records necessary for such a quantitative test, and indeed, many have kept no written records at all. Such data are difficult to acquire even for contemporary societies, according to Mansfield. Strategy in this chapter will be instead to investigate in detail three complex societies that have collapsed. The objective is not to perform a quantitative test of the explanatory framework, for that is impossible, but to ascertain whether this framework helps us to understand collapse in actual cases. The three test cases have been selected to represent a broad spectrum of socio-political complexity. To ensure that the explanation applies to different kinds of societies, given this restriction, the cases chosen represent probably the best documented examples for the respective levels of complexity. The cases are: 1, the Western Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was certainly among the most complex, entrenched, and territorially extensive societies that have collapsed. It is also one of the best documented through literary sources. This literature will be the main basis for the investigation. The classic Maya of the southern lowlands. Classic Maya civilization evolved from small independent hamlets to polities that existed at a city-state level of organization, and to regional systems in which major political centers dominated territories of perhaps a few thousand square kilometers. Although the Maya were a literate civilization, their writing is at present not fully understood. Our knowledge of the Mayan collapse comes primarily from archaeological research. 3, the Chicoan Society of the American Southwest. Organized as a hierarchical regional confederation, the Chicoans represent the most complex prehistoric society that developed on the Colorado Plateau of North America. They are also the least complex of the societies examined in this chapter, never organized as a true coercive state. The Chicoans had no written records and are solely known archaeologically. These cases, besides representing very different levels of complexity, allow us to assess the usefulness of the framework for understanding both historically and archaeologically known cases of collapse. And I'll have more from Joseph Tainter on tomorrow's program. The New York Times has declared war on Fox News host Tucker Carlson. 4 separate essays over 4 days, totaling 20,000 words. That's how serious a threat Tucker Carlson is. He's a man who talks on television for 1 hour a night to a relatively small audience, but never mind that. Tucker Carlson, the highest rated host in cable news, told Axios he hasn't read a word of this weekend's New York Times series about him, and of course won't. Why it matters. Stop patronizing us, Axios. Carlson's official Twitter account posted a photo of him holding up the newspaper, his face splashed above the fold, and laughing. The tweet is wordless. Oh, it's wordless because the picture is worth 1,000 words? You ever heard about that, Mike Allen of Axios? Yes. Times readers binged on the stories. All 4 parts were at or near the top of the website's trending rankings. Rankings Part 1 of American Nationalist by Nick Confessore spreads over 7 pages in the Sunday paper. Just the series' key takeaways run 1,500 words. Carlson's on-air technique, gleefully courting blowback, then fashioning himself as his aggrieved viewers' partners in victimhood, has helped position him, as much as anyone, to inherit the populist movement that grew up around Trump, Confessore writes, calling it Trumpism without Trump. The Times says an analysis of 1,150 episodes of the Fox News show has shown how Carlson, 52, has grown increasingly sympathetic to the nativist currents coursing through U.S. politics, and how intertwined his rise has been with the transformations of his network and of American conservatives. His narrative, they want to control, then destroy you. Carlson invoked the ruling class in more than 800 shows, showing they want you to shut up and obey. Where's the lie? Where's the lie? Clingers. Remember when Obama talked about clingers, those people clinging to their Bibles and their guns? This is when he's running for president. Does that not sound like contempt and hatred to you? This is from Portfolio Armor at Zero Hedge. You get the most flack when you're over the target. If the old saying is true, Tucker Carlson has been flying over the target. In a series of articles, the New York Times has accused the Fox News host of pushing several conspiracy theories while engaging in some armchair Freudian analysis about his motivations. Someone called Liz Plank, and this is again a violation of my two-name rule, Plank or Planck, it's pronounced in the German fashion. It seems odd in America. But her Christian name, Elizabeth, fine name. No, she's going to go Liz Plank. Liz Plank. This is not pleasing to the ear. But this unpleasant woman tweeted, Tucker's mom abandoned him as a child and vengefully left him $1 when she died. A devastating but clear origin villain story for a man to determine to do anything to feel important. Incredible reporting, Nick Confessore. So this woman was raised up on Marvel movies, apparently. Yes, origin villain story. These are the 5 conspiracy theories, according to the Times. Ruling class. Accusations that there is a ruling class intent on controlling the lives of normal people and censoring anyone who stands in its way. Fact check, true. Replacement through immigration. Assertions that there is an intentional effort to replace native-born Americans with immigrants, that immigration takes away the resources and power of native-born Americans, that the ruling class cares more about immigrants than native-born Americans, that immigrants are dirty, and that immigration leads to increases in crime. Fact check, true. Shifting gender roles. Arguments that feminism and challenges to gender norms have diminished masculinity, contributed to falling birth rates, and led to the demise of traditional family structures. Fact check, true. Look, they boast about that. The left boasts about this. Discrimination against white people. Instances in which Carlson speaks of racism against white people and plays down racism against people of color. Well, if everyone else is shouting it to the rooftops, I suppose Tucker Carlson doesn't need to do so. White people are murdered regularly by blacks in the United States, and these stories are buried, absolutely buried. Destruction of society. Instances in which warnings about the destruction of society, civilization, and traditional values. Carlson often blames the policies of the ruling class for causing society's decline and posits that crime-ridden cities, a dying middle class, and the collapse of rural America are evidence of it. Some shows matched all 5 categories, others none. We then calculated the amount of time devoted to segments that fell into at least one category. And Portfolio Armor continues. In a post last year, that's not happening, and it's good that it is. A former Trump administration official, Michael Anton, offered a handy conceptual tool to understand regime propaganda, the celebration parallax. Quote, a parallax is the apparent difference in position of the same object seen from different vantage points. For instance, an analog speedometer that reads 60 miles an hour to the driver, but 50 to the passenger, even though the needle itself is only in one place. The celebration parallax may be stated as the same fact pattern is either true and glorious or false and scurrilous, depending on who states it. In contemporary speech on any controversial topic, or to better say, regime priority, the decisive factor is the intent of the speaker. If she can be presumed to be cheerleading the phenomenon under discussion, she may shout her approval from the rooftops. If not, he better shut up before someone comes along to shut him up. Unquote. Yes, it has been suggested on Twitter that the thing that really bothers the elite about Tucker Carlson is because he is talking about the decline of the middle class, and he is talking about wealth and class. Who is getting richer and richer, and who is getting poorer and poorer? Now, Tucker Carlson, let's see. It was pointed out by Pedro Gonzalez that yes, it's only an elite that can replace an elite. And I asked the late James Burnham to fact check this for me, and he said, true. Popular revolt, any kind of popular revolt needs a leadership. Without an elite leadership, it's not going to get anywhere. This is a pretty shocking story, needless to say. You didn't see very much of it. This is based on British data. This is from dailyexpose.uk. Children's risk of death increases by 5,100% following COVID-19 vaccination compared to unvaccinated children, according to official Office for National Statistics data. Again, you can find this at dailyexpose.uk. And the science. Let's talk about science, or let's let Eugippius talk about science. Following the science is impossible and stupid, he writes on his Substack. During the pandemic, Germany closed schools on a wider scale and for a longer duration than most other places in the civilized world. I was recently reminded of how our government came to embrace these extreme policies. The story is very revealing. It began with the strange decision of state media to elevate Christian Drosten at Berlin Charité to national prominence by granting him the Coronavirus Update podcast in February 2020. The World Health Organization had just endorsed lockdowns 2 days before, and various countries were acquiring new corona SARS, random virus wizards who had become the face of containment policy to panicking domestic audiences. Every day, Drosten's banal podcast interviews were reported breathlessly across the German media as if they meant anything. It's important to remember that Drosten is a virologist. He's not a statistician, and for what it's worth, he's not a public health expert either. He studies how very small proteins work and how they interact with human cells. Nevertheless, Drosten had or claimed to have a wide range of opinions on matters outside of his field, including the question of whether closing schools would slow down SARS-2. At first, Drosten said that he didn't think this would accomplish very much. Like everyone else of his ilk, he had an early history of saying basically correct and sensible things before he went crazy. On March 11, 2020, he went home and read this paper on non-pharmaceutical interventions implemented by U.S. cities during the 1918 to 1919 influenza pandemic. It wasn't his field. His assessment of its analysis is worth no more than mine or yours. But after reading it, he decided that actually closing schools would be a great idea, especially when used in combination with other interventions, such as banning mass gatherings. This was wind in the sails of hystericists like Markus Söder, minister-president of Bavaria. And so we closed our schools, and our kids endured months of social isolation and mental anguish because Drosten read a thing and had a brilliant idea. But that's only the official story, Eugippius comments. It may be vastly worse than that. I really doubt, for example, that Drosten's ridiculous podcast was a spontaneous programming idea by Norddeutscher Rundfunk. I suspect instead that there's a reason lockdowns and corona SARS went together in those early days. Primary was the political or bureaucratic decision to do all this crazy stuff in the absence of any evidence aside from some dodgy numbers out of Wuhan. Thus, the genius smart guys who run our institutions had to find celebrity virus astrologers who could become the public face of novel policies and provide a simulacrum of science for the politicians to pretend they were following. It's even odds whether Drosten really did change his mind because of a paper he read one night, or whether it was rather the political or bureaucratic faction behind Drosten that changed their minds and gave him a paper or two to read. This concludes actually. Science isn't some objective, reasonable force outside of politics. Scientists spend most of their careers chasing government grant funding and fighting for appointments and promotions in government-funded university systems. Science follows politics, and nobody knows this as much as the disingenuous politicians who claim that their policies are subordinate to scientific findings. Yes, here. I mean, this is so obviously true. You want to go back to the 19th century, early 20th century, where you had gentlemen scientists, people who used their own money just to, pursue interesting ideas. Well, that's long gone. There are no gentlemen scientists anymore. There is big government money, big foundation money. And university money, of course, comes from government. So you say what the government wants to hear, or you don't get to be a scientist anymore. We saw that with Peter Duesberg. He was considered the foremost expert on retroviruses in the world at the time that HIV was announced to be the cause of AIDS. And because of his skepticism against the HIV AIDS hypothesis, his career was ruined, absolutely ruined. The attempt by Twitter to dismiss Alex Berenson's suit against that company for Twitter banning him has been dismissed by a judge in San Francisco. Berenson writes today, Bloomberg recently published a fascinating chart showing how different countries handled the first 2 years of COVID. Like most great data visualizations, it is simple and easy to understand once it's explained. It focuses on outcome, not process. In other words, it doesn't concern itself with how many vaccinations given or how many tests conducted or other numbers that matter mostly to the health bureaucrats who pay themselves to carry them out. Instead, it plots two variables, the number of COVID deaths and COVID's economic impact as measured by how much government growth fell short of forecasts in 2020 and 2021. The chart is set up so that top left is better and bottom right is worse. Countries in the top left had few COVID deaths and relatively strong growth. Those in the top right had lots of deaths and strong growth. Those in the bottom left had few deaths but deep recessions. Those in the bottom right had lots of deaths and deep economic pain. The relative success of Asian and Pacific Rim countries jumps out first. For reasons that remain unclear, Asian countries reported far fewer COVID deaths than any others. Why? The answer doesn't appear to be obviously demographic. Whether they were young or old, rich or poor, they had fewer deaths. Could the reason be cross immunity, some hidden genetic strength, thinness, some other factor? The truth is we don't know yet. Also keep in mind that the lack of deaths didn't necessarily translate into economic success, though Japan and Indonesia, two of Asia's most populous countries, both had severe recessions. So simple geography appears at this point to be by far the most important factor in how hard COVID hits a country. Now try the chart again without the Asian outliers. Remember, top left is best, bottom right is worst. 2 points jump out. No major Western or South American country is even close to Asia. Meanwhile, big European countries like Britain and France, which took a national hard lockdown route, has nearly as many deaths as the United States, but far worse economic pain. That's particularly true of Spain, where lockdowns were brutal in 2020. In general, Spanish-speaking countries had extremely poor outcomes despite extremely harsh lockdowns. But the country outside Asia that performed best, the one closest to the top left, Sweden. Yep, Sweden. Lockdown-free Sweden, which trusted its people and refused to shut down and pursued a herd immunity strategy without quite using that phrase, and became the subject of endless articles like this from Slate. Of course, I just came home to Sweden. I'm horrified by the coronavirus response here. Yeah. And I think I will talk about everyone being crazy tomorrow, or the idea that there is something positively good about what we used to call mad deranged, lunatic, mentally ill, or as they are now called, the neurodivergent. I'll save that up for tomorrow and wrap up the stream today with a final look at the chat. Kevin, if Emma accepted our Lord, wouldn't she be in purgatory, not hell? That depends whether she was in a state of grace when she died. And that would, depend on, whether she was found guilty of a mortal sin. And, well, there are 4 sins, according to the Catechism, crying out to heaven for vengeance, willful murder, the sin of Sodom, oppression of the poor, and cheating workers of their wages. There they are. 1, 2, 4. Who else do we have? The legal system is beyond pause, says Anran. Where's Chad Chadson when you need him, asked Don Willis. Oh, spam. Oh, God, we're being spammed. Okay. And remove. Oh, but okay. Okay. Hide user on this channel. Come on, you're supposed to disappear when I do that, when I hide it. Oh my God, this is just proliferating like crazy. This is not fun. What? Put user in timeout. Okay, come on. I don't like to see that. And I don't know, there seems to be a limit of options here. I can see them. I don't know whether other people can still see them. Okay. I hope this does not become a habit. Really, really, really. Okay. Thank you for your kind words, Don Willis. And who? Svetlana who? If you cut out all the sex stuff, the show is quite funny. Nick Mullins' show? Okay, I can't say that I'm familiar with it. The truth is in your ghettos, in your jails, in your young love, not in your courts or Congress, where the old set judgment on the young. Oh, that was Charles Manson. Okay. Okay, and that's going to be it. I'm going to be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for tuning in. It's greatly appreciated. If you would like to make a donation to this live stream, my PayPal account is linked to kevin_grace@hotmail.com. If you're in Canada, donations may be made directly to the website via interact@kevingrace@shop.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.